Eu vou apresentar o professor Clutterbuck e isso vai tomar um pouco de tempo porque o currículo dele é realmente muito extenso. David é um dos pioneiros em coaching e mentoring e ele introduziu o mentoring na Europa no início dos anos 80. Ele é credenciado como EMCC Master Practitioner, combina uma riqueza de conhecimentos baseada em pesquisa e experiência, oferecendo uma abordagem pragmática baseada em evidências para coaching, mentoring e gestão de talentos. Bom, David é autor ou coautor de mais de 70 livros. É professor visitante nos departamentos de coaching e mentoria de 4 importantes universidades: Henley Business School, Oxford Brookes, Sheffield Hallam, York St. John, e é também professor visitante em várias universidades internacionais. Ele é líder da Coaching and Mentoring International Limited, que é uma rede global de pesquisadores, instrutores e consultores especializados em coaching e mentoria em mais de 100 países. Os atuais interesses de pesquisa de David incluem transições em direção à maturidade do coach, que é um pouco do que nós vamos falar hoje, o papel da inteligência artificial no coaching, o efeito cascata do mentoring e a democratização e a descolonização do coaching. Entre seus muitos projetos beneficentes está a ambição de criar 5 milhões de treinadores e mentores para a idade escolar. Fora do trabalho, os interesses de David incluem o uso social e o bem-estar da comédia, escrever histórias infantis, patinar no gelo e explorar partes remotas do mundo. Sem dúvida, nós vamos convidar o David para explorar algumas das nossas partes remotas. Ele se coloca um desafio de aprendizado a cada ano. David, muito obrigado por estar aqui conosco. É um privilégio e uma honra tê-lo conosco. E, por favor, você tem a audiência agora.
Thank you, Flavio. I'm going to try and share my screen and bring up some slides, but let's see how successful I am. So let's do this and see if it works.
It does.
It does. How about that? That's pretty good. So can you all see? So let me put that on slideshow and see if it still works. Is it working now?
Yes, it is.
No, you probably have 2 screens. I don't see.
I have 3 screens. I'm going to swap displays.
Yeah, you have to swap screens. Yes.
And is that working?
Not yet. We still have those colorful.
We'll swap them again. Let's see what happens. How's that?
No, I don't see it.
Okay.
We just have the
I'll do a new share
colorful.
and let's go for that one. Let's see if that works. How's that?
Yes.
Hey, miracles. There we are. The technology is sometimes works. Well, welcome everybody. As Flavio says, I've been in coaching and mentoring for a very long time. And indeed, one of the things that we did right the way back in 1991, set up the first professional body in this area. And I've been engaged in educating coaches and mentors for pretty much all of that period. And I'm going to use the words coach and mentor interchangeably, but I think it's worth being very clear about what we mean by coaching versus mentoring. There's a lot of confusion that comes from basically some American academics back in the early 1980s and late 1970s who didn't understand the complexity of the story in the Odyssey from which the word mentoring comes. And so what essentially happened is that it got conflated with the idea of sponsorship. Now, sponsorship and mentoring are 2 completely different things. They don't go together. They're incompatible. And what we've learned, when we were creating the European Mentoring and Coaching Council, we first started with mentoring because nobody had coaching then. It wasn't really seen as an industry. And then along came coaches and they said, well, we're doing something special. What are you doing? And we said, well, wait, but actually, you seem to be doing what we're doing. And so and so when we looked at it, the reality is, as we've learned increasingly and explore as we go along today, that actually coaches, as they mature and become more effective, become more like mentors. And when I say that, I mean mentors in the true origins of the word. So a mentor is somebody who uses their wisdom to help somebody else become wise. And as coaches become more mature, more effective, they learn to use themselves and their experience, not to give advice, because giving advice, well, it doesn't help, but it doesn't help very much. It's not a great idea. But there's a big difference between giving context, which is about giving somebody information that will help them with the quality of their thinking, and giving them advice, which is doing the thinking for them. And as mentors, we use our knowledge to inform the questions that we ask. So coaching and mentoring, two things very much aligned. And so I'm going to explore some of those areas as we go along today. So some of the issues I thought would be fun to explore. The increasing move towards evidence-based coaching. I think one of the great things that the ICF has done in recent years is to set up its research base so that anybody can search this and for proper evidence-based articles, empirical research in coaching. Now, there's still a long way to go in creating the research. There's so many areas not really touched, but it's a really good start. And we're moving from an industry that was basically built upon people's opinions. I do this, therefore it must be right, to an industry that's actually looking for, what does the evidence tell us? And I'm going to look at some of the new applications in coaching and mentoring. We'll take a brief look at artificial intelligence and coach maturity, the transitions we make towards maturity. We currently have another major study where we've been interviewing very mature coaches from around the world about each stage of their transition through the journey to becoming a mature coach. And as Flavio says, we're going to be looking at democratization and decolonization, two terms which we're going to hear a lot more of. But first, let's just look at coaching and mentoring as developmental conversations. What we're doing as coaches is always creating or helping the person become clear. So gaining greater clarity in two contexts. The internal context is about understanding yourself, your values, your strengths and weaknesses, and your degree of self-confidence, who you are and your ambitions and so forth. And understanding yourself, it takes, what coaching does is, in particular, is to help us really understand ourselves in a much deeper way. But also there's the external context, so understanding what's going on around us. Who are our champions? What's changing in the world in which we operate? What about the systems around us? And so, what a coach or a mentor does is to help you understand more clearly the internal context and the external context and link the two. And from that, we can make much better plans of what we want to do. We can create much greater awareness, and we have much deeper reflections. Now, if we want to find some differences between coaching and mentoring, we can basically say that coaches spend more time on the internal context and less on the external context, and mentors vice versa. But we're really talking 60-40 here. We're not talking about a vast difference. And so, I think it's really good to keep in mind that this is what we're doing. We are helping people explore internal and external contexts and make better decisions around it. So here's some of the myths that we see. We see written so many in primers on coaching and beginners coaching courses We need to set clear goals at the start of an assignment. No, we don't. All the research, the evidence-based research tells us that goals evolve. That whatever goal we set at the beginning, if it hasn't changed as we've gone along, we probably haven't been coaching. Coaching needs to be solutions focused. No, not really. The need for a solution is most of the time in the head of the coach, not the client. What the client wants is to advance in their thinking. And more often than not, what's most beneficial for them is to go away with really good questions that enable them to come to their own decision about what the solutions are. Forcing solutions inside the coaching session is actually, it can be very destructive and focus people on the wrong things. We've talked about this idea of coaching versus mentoring, the idea that coaching is non-directive, mentoring is directive. Throughout its history, of both those areas, it's been the opposite way round. Up until the mid 1990s to 2000, up until that point, the vast majority of references to coaching were as a directive telling activity. And it's only in the last 25 years that coaching has come into its own as a non-directive area. And mentoring, right the way through history, has been a non-directive activity. Coaches should take copious notes, not if you're going to attend. You cannot take notes and be fully attending to the client. So what do? Well, you fully attend to the client, and then from time to time, you stop and you say, what would you like to capture from what we've just been saying? And what you're doing there is giving the control back to the client. If you take the notes, it's like the person who writes the minutes of a meeting. You're in charge. If we are truly client-centered, we focus on what the client is taking out that's useful. And it's usually something different than we think. A good coach can coach anyone in anything, not safely. You've got to be able to understand enough of the context to condone. For example, we had an example of a coach who working in financial services who knew nothing really about financial services and was actually encouraging the client to engage in insider trading. Now, because they were ignorant. So we really do need to have enough understanding to remain ethical, enough understanding of the context of the other person to ask really great questions. Coaching is a process. No, it's not. That, as we'll see when we see artificial intelligence, coaching, if it's a process, it can be duplicated by AI. Coaching is a skill, an art, an improvisation, but it's not a process. And the idea that the number of hours of coaching is a good guide to coach efficacy, well, the evidence doesn't support that. What we see is that it's almost irrelevant, the number of hours of coaching. You can repeat bad coaching for thousands of hours. And in the coach assessment centers that we've run for for multinational companies around the world, what we find is that there's no correlation between how many hours of coaching somebody has done and how competent they are. There is no correlation between how much they charge and how competent they are. What really matters, as we'll see later, is a much deeper things, like the quality of their reflection on their practice. And the client is the focus for the coaching, not anymore. If the client is the focus, we are only achieving a little bit. The client in their systems and the systems around the client are the focus for coaching in the modern world. If we try just to focus on the client themselves, we are missing all of everything that's going on. And a simple example of this is when we contract with between the client and their sponsor in the organization. It's important to make it clear to the sponsor that they can't abdicate responsibility. That actually, how is the sponsor going to create the environment where the client can actually succeed in making the changes they want to? The system is more important than the individual. So some of the things that we've seen here, one of the things we've seen here is this issue of competencies. Competencies, we need competencies. And the competency frameworks have great value. But mastery comes from breaking all those rules you learned as a beginner. And mastery is more often the result of breadth of experience rather than depth of experience. So if we want to become truly masterful coaches, we have to forget most of what we were taught as a beginner. Now, we estimate that something like 70% of coaches limit themselves simply by thinking they've got to stick to all those rules, like the things like the GROW model, all the way through their career. Well, if you're not going to become masterful if you stick with these basic beginner things. It's like riding a bicycle with stabilizers. You can't win an Olympic event if you're still using stabilizers. And so we need to, in the profession, we're having increasing focus on how do we enable people to let go of everything they learned as a beginner coach. And that's a real challenge. The other thing that we see a lot of is that coaches can collude with some of the things that go on in organizations. So I'm sure we've all been said, can you actually help the person, give them some work with their 360-degree feedback? Now, I have a long-term relationship with 360. I brought it back to the West from Russia, where it was created by the Communist Trade Union to keep line managers under control. And it hasn't changed a lot. Now, really well done 360s, where the person who's receiving the information actually decides what they want multiple direction feedback on, can be extremely valuable. But generic 360 frameworks are damaging to the individual, damaging to the organization, and very damaging to the coaching relationship. And the same is true of much of the HR bling, as I call it. And particularly performance management systems. Everybody hates performance management, and it actually delivers the opposite result in most cases of the intent. What we're now seeing as a major trend is that organizations are throwing away their traditional performance management systems, the 9-box grids, the succession plans, and all these things that actually create rigidity. Because what we're trying to do with coaching is create flexibility, and particularly in an environment where everything is changing around us. Some of the new things that we're seeing, maternity mentoring, is wonderful. It's when people come back into the workplace. Firstly, it increases the number of people who come back, or the proportion that do. It speeds up their integration. It increases the retention of them overall, and it makes the culture transparent to them, because somebody inside the corporation who has been through the same transition from being a mum or somebody on parental leave, coming back into the organization after some months away, you need to catch up with the changes in the culture. And that person, because they're in it, can do that. It's not easy to do that if you're outside the organization. So maternity mentoring, a very fast growing area of application in the coaching and mentoring field. And similarly, reciprocal coaching and mentoring. We've seen a boom in this recently because of Me Too and other diversity and inclusion initiatives. What reciprocal coaching and mentoring do is they actually make the coach or the mentor the person at a junior level. From either some of the programs we're involved with are gender-based, so the women at lower levels in the organization, and the mentees in this case are all people in the C-suite, or it could be based upon race or culture or ethnicity. But the value that the organization gets out of this is vast. Firstly, the report back from the C-suite executives. We've been in the midst of one program at the moment, and the executives have said, we've never learned so much in any program, any education that we've done, as we have through having open and honest and frank conversations with somebody who comes from a completely different background to ourselves. So then the other side of it is it educates them in such a way that they can come together and address the systemic barriers to advancement from people from disadvantaged groups. Rapidly growing area. One of the most exciting things I think we're seeing particularly in Europe. So before we go any further, can we do a poll, or just put it, if we can't, just maybe put a comment in the chat room. How often have you personally met an ethical dilemma at work in the past year? And how often has somebody brought you an ethical dilemma as a coach or mentor? So just put a brief comment maybe in the chat room. And then Gus, if you can translate some of those comments for me, that'd be great. Brilliant. Okay, we're getting a picture, aren't we? Thank you, Gus. So we're getting a picture here. We're all encountering this stuff. We actually have a research study at the moment on politics in coaching in a politicized environment, and every organizational environment is politicized. And so a big growing area is the ethical mentoring. And here we're taking the coaches inside organizations and equipping them with the skills to hold a dialogue with people who have or think they have an ethical dilemma, and helping them to work through how they're going to deal with it. So it's an extra skill set that doesn't come in normal coach training. And so there are 6 elements in the framework that we've developed around this over the years. And the first one is articulate the problem. So who's involved? What's exactly going on here? What's the context? Is this something that's new, or is it old? Is it who else is who's an influencer here? Who's affected by it? The implications. What would happen if this were repeated more frequently, or on a bigger scale? Whose opinions are we listening to and not listening to? The balance of the arguments. What's the balance of what is the zone of acceptability in terms of solutions? And the final check is, if I were to come back to this in a year's time, would I actually come to a different conclusion about it? And does it actually feel right? It's much deeper than that. There's so much more. But ethical mentoring is for me one of the most important developmental routes for coaches, and one we're seeing increasing numbers of. It's also important for coaches now to get away from linear thinking, which so many of our clients are engaged with, and move into systemic thinking. And basically, in linear thinking, we try and fix a problem. In systemic thinking, we try and understand the context of and the complexity of it. In linear thinking, we're trying to get control, whereas in systemic thinking, we're trying to liberate and empower. We're looking for discrete solutions in linear thinking. We're looking at interconnected solutions in systemic thinking. We're looking for predicted or predictable outcomes in linear thinking, but emergent and evolving outcomes in systemic thinking. Similarly, the processes and procedures, that we want them to be nice and static and easy to control, but in linear thinking. But in systemic thinking, we recognize they are constantly evolving. And our communications in linear thinking is hierarchical. In systemic, it's in every direction, it's unbounded. And in linear, we're trying to get some level of certainty. In systemic thinking, we recognize that that's a mirage, that we have to live with uncertainty. And the role of coaching is increasingly to help our clients move from linear thinking to systemic thinking. And it can be very difficult for them to do that. But we've been spending a lot of the last 20 years, we've been researching how that happens. And one of the things that we see is if you start off at a very basic level of coaching, you start thinking about the client and their problem and find them a solution. But and that's a very linear way of thinking. But if we start to move away from that, we think about the client, their situation, their values, and then help them to find a solution. If we get even more into systems, we're looking at the client and their values, the context, the coaching relationship, and emerging ways forward. And then at the when we get really into systems, we're looking at how the client and their systems interact and how the coaching relationship becomes part of those systems. Then we find our emergent ways forward. And we typically come out of it not with solutions, but with emergent questions. Now, this is a very broad framework, and it fits very much with what I'm going to say in a while about coach maturity. But we have to, I think, make the progression to true systemic thinking for ourselves so that we can enable to bring our clients along into it as well. And when we see the layers of complexity, you can see it starts with coaching somebody to solve a problem or achieve a goal. Then we might help the leader to coach individuals. We might help the leader to become more systemically aware, and then to build a coaching culture in their team. And then we might graduate to coaching the team as a whole, or a team of teams. And maybe finally we get to coaching the whole ecosystem. Here's a step-by-step journey, if you like, towards coaching a greater level of coaching impact. We can have some impact on an individual. We can have even greater impact on the team, even greater again on a team of teams, and again even greater on the ecosystem of the organization. But we're increasingly seeing that the journey for coaches is a journey further and further into complexity. And what we learned from our major studies, including work with the highest performing teams in some of the world's biggest companies, is that there are 6 critical elements to every team that define its performance. One of them is its purpose and motivation. What are we here for, and does it energize us? Another one is how we relate to our stakeholders. The third one is the relationships, particularly the degree of psychological safety in the team. Then there's the internal processes, how we communicate, how we make decisions, and so forth. Then there's the learning processes. How do we keep the pace of our learning ahead of the pace of the change within our environment? And then there's leadership. And leadership is changing radically too. Leadership is no longer about being the leader. Leadership is about the distribution of leadership functions between the titular leader and the team themselves. And in studies that we've done, we've tried to identify what is it that leaders actually do. And we found a few studies that do this. We've involved people in all sorts of workshops talking about what leaders do. The fascinating thing is we can only find 2 things that only the leader can do. One of those is to get sign-off for resources from above. And the other is to protect the team from interference from outside so it can get on with its job. Everything else can be distributed in whole or part amongst the team. Now, how we choose to do that and how much we choose to do that is a question for each team itself. But when somebody comes along and says, we've got a problem with trust in this team. Can you come as a coach and help us to build trust in this team? The answer that I would give is, well, no, because what the trust is, the lack of trust is not the problem. The lack of trust is a symptom of what's happening in each of these other 6 things. And the way that they are working, whether they're positively or negatively working, will be influencing that trust. For example, if your external stakeholders are withholding resources so that people within the team are competing with resources, it's going to undermine trust. Every problem that we are presented with by a team turns out to be a symptom of deeper systemic issues. So as coaches, we actually have to be able to work with these systemic processes. And then, of course, make it even more complex. We work with teams of teams. And in our current research on teams of teams, we found that we can connect teams in between and actually make teams more effective, a bit like a flock of birds changing direction. How do they do it without banging into each other? Well, the substitutes we have here is collective vision. So making sure that all the teams have the same idea of the purpose of the organization and how their purpose as a team supports the purpose of the other teams. How we collect information. So what's happening in our environment that other teams would find useful. The resources, how we move people around between teams. The invention. It's amazing how often we find that one team in an organization invents something, it's great, but it's not adopted by other teams in the same organization. It goes round to competitors before it comes back into that team, into that organization. In voice, how do people who disagree, who have a different view but are not being heard, how can they, when they are on their own, they have no voice. When they come together, they get listened to. Me Too is a great example of that. And then regrouping. How do we respond to change, things that are happening in our environment by creating instantaneous new teams? The typical way is it goes up the trees. Somebody at the top level decides it, it then gets passed down and takes ages to do. In a true flocking environment, a truly responsive environment, it happens very, very fast because you've got the structures there to enable the teams to communicate and to immediately create new teams. So these are some of the things. These are areas in which we are seeing an enormous growth of potential and opportunities for coaches. So let's look briefly at AI before we get too far into this. AI has there's lots of benefits from AI, but basically it's very good at things that are repetitive and where you can predict it. It's quite good at experimenting with miscellaneous data and looking at the whole picture. But it's not good at anything that has an understanding of changing context, or that involves a conflict of values, or extrapolates from one context to another context. And so if we look at the concept of wisdom, AI is very good at doing lean wisdom, things you can, where it's very context or task specific. It's not very good at doing broad wisdom, which is about reflecting on life, or meta wisdom, where you bring together lots of different bodies of knowledge. And so these are where we as coaches can keep ahead of AI. AI is terrible in many cases at understanding where it introduces biases. This is why if you're more likely to be run over by an electric car if you have a black face than a white face, because of the biases of the programmers. And they oversimplify situations. So there's a lot of dangers. But if we look at it practically, doing of coaching is easily replicated by an AI. If your coaching practice is based on the GROW model and that's all that you do, and then an AI can already do it better than you can. And indeed, there's a paper just about to come out from Ashridge and Witwatersrand in South Africa universities, which basically has looked at this and says, yeah, basic level coaching can already be done better by an AI than a human. But that's doing of coaching, the being of coaching, your presence, your intuition, your compassion. These are things that cannot be replicated by AI. So if we want to work with AI as a coach, we can use it for all sorts of things, monitoring the emotions of the client, looking at different scenarios and doing scenario analysis, finding hidden patterns, suggesting things we can do. Well, why don't you try this question, and so forth, getting through stuckness. There are many, many ways in which we can partner with AI. I'm going to spend a brief moment on coach maturity. And then I'm probably going to come to a halt because I don't want to talk for too long. But in the research we've done, we've been out over the last 20 years, we've identified there are 4 basic mindsets or mind frames that coaches go through. So when you're a models-based coach, you've just got the grow model. You've been introduced to the basics. And it's all about taking control and using your model. And so this is doing coaching to people. And then you get a bigger toolkit. You become more confident. You allow the client to actually have more of a say about how you deal with the issue. So you're now doing coaching with the client. And then after quite a break, and a lot of learning and a lot of reflection, you become a philosophy-based coach. And here you are integrating who you are as a human being with what you do as a coach. And then the systemic eclectic. And these are wonderful to watch. And basically, the way that we describe the systemic eclectic is that they hold the client while the client has the conversation they need to have with themselves. I'll say that again. They hold the client while the client has the conversation they need to have with themselves. And this is a very, very different kind of conversation. But you see, all the way through this, 2 things are happening. We are letting go. We're letting go of the need to control. We're letting go of the need to have clear goals. We're letting go of our need to have to come out with solutions in the session. We are focusing more and more on the client and less on the process. And the kind of things they reflect on are their philosophy of coaching, the business context, freedom from the tyranny of the question. These coaches aren't spending all their time thinking, what's the next question I'm going to ask? They know that the question will come to them. And if it doesn't, then they can have a pause and let the client think a little bit more, because the client will always start talking again. They think about how they use supervision, how their own development, the boundaries they work within, and their personal journey as a coach, both where they've come from and where they're trying to go to. They're very clear they can't work with everybody. So who do they work best with? And they have a really strong idea of what makes a fully functioning person and what makes a fully functioning, effective organization. And all of this enables them to take a strong systemic view of what's going on for that client in the multiple contexts that affect that client. And I think one of the key qualities that we see in them is compassion. And I'm going to end here, because I wanted to keep to time. Well, no, I'm going to jump a couple of slides if I may. But just compassion is about, and is how we build it. We think about how we think. We think about how we feel. We feel about how we think, and we feel about how we feel. And the next few slides that I prepared are basically on that same theme, and we can come back to them later. But I'd like to take us to this question here. So it's decolonizing and democratizing coaching. Coaching has become dominated by a set of assumptions from a very narrow set of cultures. It's basically European and North American. The rest of the world is pushing back and saying, actually, that's not what coaching looks like in our cultural situation. A classic example, in normal Western-dominated coaching, you would see that you'd have a goal, and you'd say to the client, "What do you want to? What's your issue?" And the client would say, "Well, what I want to achieve from this conversation is X," and then you would work out, and finally you would come to something that they can go away with usefully. In many Asia Pacific cultures, it's quite the opposite. You start off with saying, "Well, I'm not really sure what the issue is, but let me paint the picture." And you work in from the outside. And by the time you've described everything that's going on, you've defined the issue far more clearly, and you've also reached a conclusion. Now, what we're learning is that effective coaching coaching can be much more effective when you've got both of these dimensions going on, when you're able to switch between one and the other. And even the research that we see, most research around the world is being done in North America and Europe. We need to and that just is reinforcing the problem. There's this issue of is coaching a profession or a vocation. What really worries me is the preponderance of webinars that we see on coaching, how to make more money as a coach. Even how to develop yourself is about how to make more money. And this movement away with this identity of coaching as a profession rather than a vocation, when in my view it should be both, is I think something that we need to address. And it's in this issue is coaching is mostly happens to people who are already privileged, who can afford it, rather than people who need it most. And our big challenge, or one of our big challenges, is how do we take coaching and mentoring to those people who cannot afford it? The people in the favelas, for example. How do people who will most benefit from coaching get access to coaching? I think it's a challenge which the coaching world has really got to stand up to and look at in depth. So we can change. The question is, how can we as coaches change society for the better? Getting involved in climate change coaching, for example, an important thing. Becoming a social movement for wiser leadership, rather than helping yet another narcissistic executive climb up that greasy pole to the top, to the executive suite. The ethical coach program in Ethiopia was a test bed for countries that are relatively wealthy to support the creation of coaching capability in a country that has nothing, or no real basis for coaching, and it's been incredibly successful. Coaching and mentoring as life skills. This is what the cool coaching project that we have for school kids is for. And the narrative to widative, as I call it. So how do we help leaders of today become good ancestors, creating a world through their wise leadership that their grandchildren's children will appreciate and thank them for? For me, these are all questions that we as coaches should be asking ourselves, both individually and collectively. So I'm going to stop there and simply and say, what are your thoughts, questions, comments, challenges? There we go. I'm going to unshare. So what are your thoughts? Have I outraged you, challenged you? What would you like to say more on? So, Rosangela.
Flávio, acho que está mudo.
You have a few more minutes. You said you passed over some slides. If you want to go do a deep dive on something, feel comfortable to. People are just in a state of awe with your presentation.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well. The things the key things that I passed over is this relationship between maturity and other factors. So, in particular, maturity and emotional connectedness. So, at a basic level, at a models-based level, we can have sympathy with somebody else. But if we get to a process-based, we start thinking we can have empathy, and sympathy carries no. You could be sympathetic, but you don't do anything. Empathy is where you really feel with the other person, and so it's much deeper. But then we can go for empathy with the person and their situation. So it's not just about the individual; it's about the individual in their context. And the systemic eclectics will have empathy not just with the individual, but the whole system of which that individual is a part. I was doing some supervision this morning, and the theme that we were looking at was a dysfunctional team and a dysfunctional organization. And the question we explored was, where is the pain in the system? And the pain was in all sorts of places. And we ended up mapping the pain in the pain points in that system. Now that, that's taking coaching into a much deeper level than we normally would. But understanding the pain of the system gives us so many more levers to pull in creating positive change. And the other side of this is how we use ourselves. So we can use ourselves to understand an issue from our perspective. But it's important to understand, we do achieve more by understanding the issue from the client's perspective. If we can then move to understanding the issue from multiple perspectives, so the other stakeholders and players, and then to do it holistically, then those are different levels of which we can work at. And all the way through, if we can use our own knowledge and our own wisdom to support each of these processes, we are adding so much more value. We are using ourselves, not a simplistic set of tools or processes. It is quite fascinating that when in our research on the most mature coaches, we found that they have enormous toolkits and they use them far, far less than the beginner coaches. So the bigger the toolkit you have, the more confidence you have, and the fewer tools you use. So that's a summary.
Thank you, David. There are, well, first, this is not an exaggeration. People are really in a state of awe. They are appreciating every word you said. It was a very exciting and bold sometimes, and this was great for everybody, I guess. We have some questions. Would you expand a little bit the concept of evidence-based coaching, and how does it transform the coaching practice?
Okay, so when I talked about the myths earlier, when we see a statement that's made about something, we want to know, is it true? Or evidence-based coaching would take an area, an aspect of coaching, and say, well, what do we know about this? And very often the answer is nothing. So an example of this, we quite a few years ago, my good friend and I, David Megginson at Sheffield Hallam University, we did the first and only study of endings of coaching relationships. So what does a good ending look like? And what we found was that there was a very clear correlation, over 80% correlation, that if you just let the relationship drift away, it was felt by both coach and coachee to be negatively afterwards. If you celebrated what you'd achieved, even though you hadn't achieved everything, it was almost always seen as positively by both parties afterwards. Now, there's been one academic paper looking at trying to pull together a sort of macro paper around this, but that's about the limit of the literature in this area. Now, and if you know other studies, great, tell me about it. But we've not been able to find very much there. And now we're about to launch a study of endings of team coaching assignments. So, how do you withdraw from a whole team? And some of the issues relating there, for example, the team leader may feel confident and happy for that to take over the role of a coach to their team, but some of the team members may feel dependency on you. So you've got different levels of dependency by the team members, and some of them will feel happy for you to go and they're confident, and some of them will not. There are all sorts of factors there that haven't been explored, and virtually every assumption that we make about coaching, we can find areas where we actually have assumptions but don't have evidence. Which is great if you want to get involved in research. We have a term which we invented last year, and seems to have gone viral, which is Pracademic. So this is a practitioner academic. So practitioners using academic research methods or partnering with academics to do really valuable research. And the value of Pracademia is that academics produce research which satisfies their needs for their intellectual needs, but has no impact on the profession. Academic practitioners often do research which basically is not well constructed or valid. Pracademia allows us to do both, to have really valid research which addresses the real issues that coaches face.
Excellent. There was a question on developing your systemic perspective. It is might be easier said than done, and we would like to capture your perspective on how to move forward to a broader perspective, a systemic perspective.
The simplest way of doing this is basically to train as a team coach. And I say that because you can work with an individual and you can help them to see the impact of the systems around them, but it's still very limited. But the key to getting the systemic view is to work with the complexity, the messiness of it. I certainly found long ago that when I go into a one-to-one coaching situation, I have a pretty good idea of where the conversation's going. If I know exactly where the conversation's going, it's not coaching. But you know, I've been here before. But when you get into a team situation, everything is messy. I know that every team coaching assignment will go off in directions I have no idea, and I'm going to spend some time thinking, what on earth do I do now? And that's the great joy of it, because you're constantly creating, you're improvising in the situation. So in order to think systemically, we have to have really good grounding in teams and team systems and ecosystems, and that we can only really, the only real way of doing that is through team coaching.
Excellent. You mentioned that coaching is more of a vocation than a profession. So should coaching schools do some sort of admission tests on vocation, just like music schools, architecture, design schools? What are your thoughts on this?
I think it's a great idea, probably impractical, but a great idea. But I do think there is a balance. As I said, it's a balance between between being a profession and being a vocation. You can be professional in your. You can have professionalism in a vocation, and I think that's the way I like to see that if we're going to emphasize the vocation of coaching, then that vocation should be professional, should have professional ways of working. And that's what the standards, the codes of conduct and ethics are, those are all about the professionalism, but professionalism is not the same as professionalizing.
Okay, I think that's understood. It's interesting, an interesting perspective. So in the same direction, what are your thoughts on coaching certification as applied by ICF, for example?
Okay, so I'm not going to criticize any of the body. All the bodies take slightly different approaches, and it's what's the value of accreditation. So we can't find from our assessment centers any strong link between accreditation and mastery. And I think that's because mastery happens above the level of accreditation. But it's absolutely essential that people should be working to a clear set of rules, that people should pursue a level of study. They should be continuously improving themselves as coaches. And the accreditation processes are a way of managing that. So I think there's an enormous value from that. But I do worry about anything that is a tick box process. So, you've got 4 questions to answer, which is the right answer. And I say that because I sat in on somebody rehearsing for one of their, I think for their PCC examination. And we were going through the answers, and we were saying, well, it's none of those answers. Actually, for somebody at the mastery level of coaching, the answer is something completely different. But of course, at that level of that she was working for, I mean, she was a very experienced coach, but she was going through the process of getting the accreditations. So she's got to go through the system. So the answers that she had to give for that level, which were perfectly correct for that level, were not the answers she would have given as a truly masterful coach. And I think that's a real dilemma. So how do we manage that? I don't have a simple answer to it, but I think it is a barrier to people who are already masterful coaches. They don't want to go through the Mickey Mouse steps of the accreditation, and so some way of grandfathering people in might be a sensible thing to look at. If it's any help, I would not pass the ACC examination, because all the answers I would give would be at a completely different level.
Well, I hope ICF doesn't see us as terrorists here. You mentioned artificial intelligence in your presentation. Could you expand that a little more? Is it actually being used? Are there artificial intelligence systems, let's say commercial artificial intelligence systems available? Are they used in what circumstances or in which contexts?
Okay, so at the moment, what we're seeing is coach bots. Coach bots are not AIs. Coach bots do not learn. So the distinguishing factor of an artificial intelligence is that it extrapolates data from its interactions and learns in a way that we cannot follow. So whereas with a coach bot, it's limited it's confined, it's limited, it works through clear processes, and when it stops, when it comes into those processes, it stops. So it has no learning capacity. So virtually everything on the market at the moment is a coach bot. However, we have had for several years now artificial intelligence engines in therapy. And the University of Southern California has had one, which is a trauma therapist for soldiers coming back from the Middle East. The majority of the soldiers in therapy prefer the robot to a human, and one of the reasons is they find it less judgmental. And so this is not so the only thing that's holding it back is well, the US military can afford to spend a lot of money on trauma for soldiers. So it's the amount of investment that takes place. But sooner or later, as the degree of investment comes down and down, we are going to see AIs doing more and more of what we do. And if you are a grow model coach, you are probably or at that basic level, you're under threat. if you have advanced beyond that, if you are bringing yourself increasingly into your coaching, you're using judgment and wisdom, then you can stay ahead of the AI.
Okay, there is another question. If we are to be freed from the slavery of questions, what goes in the empty space?
Okay, well, let me share with you a simple tool technique. We call it the rule of three. So here you are, you've asked a question, the client is responding. And now your brain says, now, what am I going to say when they stop talking? And beginner coaches get very nervous about this. And so instead of attending to the client, their brain is thinking, what am I going to say next? And a really mature coach basically says, okay, that's all right. I don't need to have that, to have another question. And in fact, I'm going to park that question and just listen. And when the client stops talking, they say, yeah, or what else? And the client continues to talk. And that question comes back again. And you go through the same process. Well, I'm not going to ask it now. I'm going to let it mature a little bit. And only on the third time the question comes to mind do you actually ask it. 9 times out of 10, the client asks themselves a better question, or your question has improved because it's marinated. And I think the power of the question is so much better by being allowed to mature in our mind.
Lovely. You mentioned that to develop a broader perspective, a systemic view, team coaching might be, an entry point for that. What about groups, coaching groups, not necessarily teams that have an objective to reach?
Yeah. So most of the so-called teams that we get asked to work with are teams only in name. They do not behave like teams. They're a bunch of people who report to the same manager. So a lot of our work starts with group coaching and helping that group become a team. But if I understand the question correctly, in many cases, there is no need for a group of people to become a team. So we can use many of the same tools, but what we try and do is to help them develop the skills of coaching each other. And as with team coaching, the role of the coach is to make ourselves less and less needed, to be role models for the kind of conversations they can have with each other. And that applies equally with teams and with groups.
There was in fact, this is an ask here. We would really appreciate if you could forward us after this presentation some interesting articles that
Sure. Yeah.
might lighten some of the ideas you brought. There was a question here on asking you to please go into a little deeper into ethical mentoring or ethical mentorship.
Okay. The roots of this were the financial services when there were the collapse of financial services organizations and the scandals in financial organizations in the 2006, 2007. And it was the financial services sector, some of the professional bodies there, that said we should be actually providing ethical mentors or to help people really give somebody who might be a whistleblower somebody to talk to. To help them make better decisions that don't harm themselves and don't harm the organization. Then it was picked up in the health area, in the health sector. And major health organizations like the UK National Health Service or Médecins Sans Frontières have really taken deeply to this whole idea of having somebody that anybody in the organization can go to and say, look, this doesn't seem right to me, but I'm not sure what to do about it. And to be able to have a confidential conversation. And it could range from anything from things that are illegal to a doctor that's actually harming patients, through to things like sexual harassment or inappropriate behavior in the workplace. So it's very sometimes it's about individuals, but mostly it's about systemic issues. You know, in this organization, everybody turns a blind eye to whatever, something that's wrong. And what the ethical mentor does is to help you work out, is this really wrong? Is it, what's my responsibility here? What's the responsibility of the organization? What are practical ways to bring this issue into the open? So it's a very skilled role, because you've got to understand the politics of the organization. You've got to understand what's practical. You've got to be able to divorce your own empathy for the other person, or in some cases your dislike of the other person, because sometimes the people who actually reveal what's wrong are people who are pretty unpleasant in themselves. So you've got all of that entanglement, which makes it a fascinating and complex role.
Another question. There are some of our clients are process-oriented and some are people-oriented, let's put it this way. So it's part of our work to build compassion or empathy in our clients. Any thoughts on developing that?
I think that one of the starting points is having compassion for yourself. And if we have compassion for ourselves, it's easier to have it for other people. I like the exercise, which is in the slides, which is just thinking about somebody who really irritates you, and thinking about what compassion could you have for them? What kindness could you do to them? And actually choosing people who are the most irritating people to show kindness to. That's a real test of our own compassion. Intriguingly, we did a study. It wasn't a deeply empirical study, but it had a wide literature range. We looked at all the modern literature of what are the qualities of a great leader in the modern world, and also what are the qualities of a great coach. And guess what? They were the same. And there were 4 qualities we identified. So one was compassion. One was curiosity, being really interested in other people and what's going on and the environment and so forth. The third one was courage, being able to face up to the difficult issues, to be the courage to be vulnerable. And the fourth one was connectedness. So really linking with everything that's happening, that the wider systems, to other people you would having simple things like having lunch with people in the organization who you would never normally talk to. It's also connected. Some of my colleagues in Southern Africa talk about Ubuntu, which means I am because we are. And it's building that deep sense of connectedness. And it's those same 4 qualities appear to be the fundamentals of great leadership and the fundamentals of great coaching.
David, there were I guess some people would like to ask you to please expand a little bit on what you call evidence in evidence-based coaching. It might not have been fully understood.
Okay, so when we talk about evidence, we it's really, how do we know something is true? And so an example would be where we started with goals, for example. So the idea that you've got to have a very clear and specific goal at the beginning of a coaching assignment. So some at the Institute of Coaching at Harvard, they set out to test this. How do we know this is true? What's the experience of coaches? And they interviewed 200 coaches. 192 of them said no. The goal has to, if the coaching is good, the goal will evolve and change. So that's a good example of a very simple piece of so we've got this assumption. How can we test it? Sometimes we test it with surveys. Sometimes we test it simply by sitting in and observing. So how, for example, an interesting piece of research, of evidence-based research, would be how much of the coaching conversation is past focused, present focused, and future focused. And how does that relate to the quality, the perceived quality or value of the coaching conversation? Nobody's ever done that study, to my knowledge, by the way. It's a great one. Would be, but you can see how you would you might have some assumptions about this, but how would you how would you test them? Or what you would probably learn from this is that when you're talking, when you're doing past, when your focus is more on the past, you're edging towards the elements of therapy. When you're talking about the present, you're probably solving problems. When you're talking about the future, you're talking much more about development. But we don't know. Those are assumptions. We could test them very easily with a piece of research.
Sorry. Well, there was one question which I think here, at least here in Brazil, in ICF Brazil, we might answer, which was related to how to expand or to extend coaching to people who cannot afford it. I would say that our president candidate, who is here, she might have a say on this. And Marcia, who is our head of social responsibility for ICF Brazil, might have a say on this. We have, at least in ICF, we have a strong team dedicated to offering coaches to NGOs and to other groups that are underprivileged, so to speak. But you might expand that a little bit.
Sure. I mean, all of those things are absolutely great, and the areas that we can get involved in include climate change, for example, but the social impact, and I think the leadership deficit, is in. So we got lots of leaders, but they don't lead effectively. And so, I think that's an area for coaches to get involved with. But it's one thing to offer coaching, and I think all the major, certainly the three biggest professional bodies in the field have offer pro bono coaching to people to people that need it. What we're not offering widely is pro bono training of coaches. So if you take a rural village, I sponsor a school in Uganda. Now, one of my marks of this is, if we really wanted to make an impact, training the teachers there to be coaches, to not just to the students, but to people in the village, the village, most of whom are can't read or write. This would be a valuable thing to do. So it's not just about delivering coaching; it's about distributing the expertise of coaching, and that's a whole big area of social responsibility that I think is well worth exploring.
Sure. Yeah, that would have an exponential effect on the lives of the underprivileged people.
Yeah,
for sure.
I mean, in our experiment with the schools, we've been experimenting with various countries. In one school in Malaysia, they very, very poor district. They in the year before we did the experiment, they expelled, I think, 8 or 10 students, and this was normal. They would normally expend anything between 8 and 20 students a year. They simply put in the coaching and mentoring program, where students coached and mentored each other. And in the year that program was running, there was not a single expulsion.
That's awesome. David, we are near the end, but there's one final question here. Do you work with coaching and mentoring in the same process? And how does it appear to the client? How to make coaching and mentoring transparent to people?
So
in the same process.
So when we are working with coaching, we would have a clear set of objectives we're trying to work with, and they would tend to be normally be short term, and we would not be using much, and we would not be offering that level of contextual information. So we might be using that contextual information to craft really good questions, but we would not necessarily make it explicit. And there's a video of me doing a mentoring session with somebody where in Spanish, it's translated into Spanish, I think, and about halfway through, I stopped and said, well, I've experienced this with somebody else, this issue, who is very similar situation. Would it be helpful if I shared that situation with you at this point? And they say, well, yeah, sure, go ahead. So I share this other person's experience, and then I say, so is that relevant? And they say, no. Okay, that's fine. So we move on, and then 2 minutes later, they suddenly pause and say, oh, it was relevant. Yes, I see that. And so now the penny has dropped. And so I think it's that contracting. When we want to move from one mode to the next, we always have to recontract. And sometimes it's not just about recontracting between coaching and mentoring, but facilitation too. So, yeah, I'm going to put on my facilitation hat here, particularly when we're working with teams. So there are a number of different hats we might play, but we have to we have to be very clear and explicit about which ones we're going to move into at the time, and they have to agree. And that might even apply if we're going to move, if we feel we're in one of those situations where the person is going to do something either illegal or really dangerous or really stupid. In which case we step entirely out of coaching or mentoring, and we basically say, look, I'm going to give you my opinion on this. I think that's really dumb. Now, there's not many times that we would do that, but if we're going to do that, we signal the fact that we have stepped outside of our normal coaching or mentoring role.
Yeah. David, we are close to closing. Yeah. And there are some very quick housekeeping words from Sandra related to CCUs and other things. Sandra, would you please jump in?
Nós tivemos aí uma experiência incrível, foi muito rica. David deixou um gosto aí de quero mais, muito maravilhosa, muito maravilhoso esse momento aqui. Para que você possa garantir o seu certificado de participação, preencha o formulário, nós estamos deixando um link aí no chat. Saiba mais sobre a ICF, estamos nas redes, ICF, @ICF.Brasil é o nosso Instagram. Nos acompanhe nas redes sociais. E esperamos vocês nos nossos próximos eventos. Muito obrigada, David. Fiquei muito encantada e acredito que toda a nossa audiência também.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Go safely and well, everyone.
David, I wish I could translate everything that I've been reading in the chat. It was awesome. It was enriching. It was counterintuitive at times and bold. And we just loved it. It says incredible, perfect from beginning to end. We're grateful. All of that. So thank you very much, David. This was really an experience for us. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you all for listening to me. Go safe and well.
Obrigada a todos. Obrigada, David.
Goodbye,
Tchau,
David.
Sandra,
Thank you very much.
o link não veio.
Já colocamos o link, mas vamos repetir.
Chegou? Porque o pessoal estava pedindo.
Já passou.
Por favor.
Coloco novamente. Colocou novamente.
Obrigada.
Lá vai o link.
Veio.
Agora veio.
Sim, tá aqui.
Obrigada.
Foi excelente.
Muito obrigada.
Parabéns, viu, gente? Maravilhoso.
Muito obrigada a todos vocês pela presença, participação incrível de todos. Muitas perguntas.